and welcome everybody to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. In this podcast today, we are going to talk about the mystical Tibet and its connections to the Hollow Earth and the mysteries surrounding the magical Shambhala. And I am joined with the incredible Stephen Denman today. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing, my brother?
Hello, Zach. I'm doing well, and I hope all's good with you.
Very good, my bro. So first of all, let's just give a breakdown on the mysticism that surrounds Tibet and this incredible culture of the East.
If you go back many decades, I suppose you could go right back to the Victorian age, the Edwardian period. You know, Lhasa in central Tibet was always known as the Forbidden City. Westerners never really visited. You know, there's obviously that movie called 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt in it, about the adventures that him and his colleague had into the forbidden city of Lhasa. So we know that there's always been a lot of intrigue from Western occultists, Eastern occultists, from individuals involved in metaphysics, from even people like Madame Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky from the Theosophical Society, you know, in regards to the secrecy and the fascination to do with Tibetan Buddhist wisdom, to do with the arcane knowledge and actually the different aspects of occult technology that have been known to be long concealed, in vast quantities and caches beneath the city of Lhasa in central Tibet, as well as around the Tian Shan Mountains and the eastern Himalaya. So there's a lot of connections between the city of Lhasa, the forbidden city of central Tibet, and obviously Tibetan Buddhism and Bonpo shamanism, and also connections going right the way back to the time of the civilization of Atlantis and the destruction of Atlantis around 10754 BC to 10753 BC. That's when the Atlantean islands were kind of finally destroyed. There'd obviously been previous upheavals on a geological level before that with the Atlantean continent many aeons before. And so there was a dispersal of colonists of these Nordic Atlanteans, many of which did actually travel out into what is now known as the Tibetan Autonomous Region in southwestern China, and they deposited various kinds of occult technology which were covertly inherited by Tibetan Buddhists and Bonpo shamanists. And so there's a lot of different levels of fascination and interest to do with Tibetan mysticism. It's geographically a very interesting part of planet Earth.
So how does Tibet connect with the Hollow Earth and the concept that there are these subterranean tunnels running through the earth? So what's that about?
Well, that's a really big subject, and it's for Tibetan Buddhists, the idea of Shambhala or Shambhala, which is from the Sanskrit language, which means peaceful place. It really represents a set of spiritual values, of ethics, of guidelines connected to Tibetan Buddhism. So it's not just seen as some kind of etheric, radiant crystal city that resonates beyond space-time, deep below the level or the surface of planet Earth, that can be reached through the various subterranean passages that are also known as luminous tunnels in many different cultures and tribal groupings, especially if you look at, for example, countries like Brazil and Paraguay and Chile and Argentina in South America, where there's very long-term stories, legends, and tales going right back to the time of the Spanish Conquistadors, referring to these luminous tunnels into the golden cities of the Hollow Earth. So those golden cities, could be a plural version of the singular, and they could obviously represent some aspect of Shambhala, the peaceful place.
And the Dalai Lama, just to interrupt there, sorry, the Dalai Lama actually does mention Shambhala and actually talks about it, about the world within. So he talks about it in a metaphysical.
Yeah, Tenzin Gyatso, who is the current Dalai Lama, has mentioned Sambhala or Shambhala, the peaceful place, on quite a few occasions in some of the public lectures or public talks that he has given in regards to Buddhism in general, but aspects of Buddhism connected to Tibetan mysticism. And we have to remember that it's interesting that Buddhism really is a very secular type of religion, because it doesn't emphasize any ponderance or really appreciation or focus on the importance of acknowledging the universal creator, the infinite oneness, the infinite nowness of the divine mind, the eternal mind of the creator. It's much more to do with each soul personality maintaining their integrity, releasing various types of negative emotions. It's about the control, the balance, and the stability of the human mind. It's about, in a constructive way, controlling the egocentric or the egoic part of the human mind. But there is aspects of Tibetan Buddhism that do, although they're not many, that do focus on the divine, that focus on the universal creator. And it's those aspects that are connected to Sambhala or Shambhala, and therefore the hollow earth. I think that's what the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, would be referring to.
So back in 2006, I remember watching a Dispatches documentary on three men that actually traveled and did a documentary on the secret entrances within Tibet to this hollow earth.
Right.
And that was actually started my whole intrigue into the hollow earth. Unbelievably, it was on Channel 4.
Yes.
These temples that were built, this is what I've looked into, that these temples were built on particular entrances.
That's
correct. Where they could actually go
correct.
into the hollow earth.
That's right. Yeah. So you have individuals like the Italian writer and journalist who he actually used the name of Peter Colosimo, and he wrote a book called Not of This World. And he goes into great detail about some of the Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, in the Forbidden City of Lhasa in central Tibet. And also there's actually, just on the side note, there's interconnecting very deep level subterranean passageways linking many of these Buddhist monasteries across the landmass of the Tibetan Autonomous Province, going up into the eastern Himalaya and the Tian Shan Mountains. And also, from what is being said in regards to Tibetan folklore, up into the Kunlun Mountains as well. So it appears as though there are these very remote, isolated Buddhist monasteries that exist that are not publicly accessible. And I think that's being done obviously deliberately. And it's in those locations where you have major entrances, I would say, into the hollow earth that are connecting into the basement areas of these Buddhist monasteries. And the various Panchen lamas and the ordinary Buddhist monks obviously guard very preciously these secrets, and they're kept away from the inquisitive minds of Western occultists and Eastern occultists. And, anyone who's an author or a researcher that would like access to put that information out there. So we're not going to see that kind of information in regards to Sambhala or Shambhala and its connections to Tibetan mysticism and the hollow earth, in any great detail on the internet, because if they were to start discussing these passageways that are probably go back to the antediluvian period, that means they go back before the Great Flood. So we're going back into definitely the Upper Paleolithic and around the Bronze Age. So a lot of very bizarre activity was going on in the ancient world that we're not privy to now, that isn't talked about, is not accepted as usual by Western science, isn't taught in regards to Tibetan Buddhism and the importance of the Forbidden City of Lhasa in central Tibet and its connections via luminous tunnels. And these tunnels, by the way, in Tibetan folklore are described as exuding a radiance that seems very greenish in color.
Well, the luminous, the algae, and all,
much green within it. Yeah.
All the illuminated algae. But no, just when you mentioned about Tibetan folklore, just discuss a little bit more about that, because that's always a good way of looking at culture.
So Tibetan folklore is obviously on a more local level, and that connects to Bonpo shamanism, and that that predates the advent or an introduction of at the time it would have been Indian Buddhism and Nepalese Buddhism into what has become the Tibetan Autonomous region in southwestern China. So Bonpo shamanism was the actual predecessor. It's a bit like Mongolian Tengriism, which is to do with the worship of various astral deities. So it's a shamanic religion. So that was very much focused on the idea of subterranean dwellings or expanses or reaches where even light beings were described as existing, where the mountain dwarves, the cavern dwarves, as well as the mountain giants and the cavern giants existed privately in large numbers, and would come to the surface in what would be classed today as the Eastern Himalaya or the Tian Shan Mountains or the Kunlun Mountains. In the night time, they perhaps were foraging for food, looking for artifacts, maybe devices, remnants of occult technology. Again, that's just sheer speculation on my part, but whatever's going on, there's a lot of interconnectivity there. And then obviously Tibetan Buddhism comes along, it emerges. You have obviously the succession of all the Dalai Lamas that control the Panchen Lamas and the Buddhist monks and all the monasteries. And so there was a very orchestrated, very strict form of religious imposition really placed on the landmass of Tibet over the original Bonpo shamanism. But today there's actually an interesting mix. Both of them balance with each other. They're very compatible. And that's also another interesting cultural aspect of Tibetan mysticism.
What I find so mind-blowing is the way people who look into this information believe that they actually know there's no entrances in the Himalayas, when something like the Himalayas is so vast. And why would you know? Like, there is so much to this earth we haven't explored, and it shocks me.
Yeah. No, you're totally correct. It's just the arrogance of Western science that just dismisses out of hand the possibility that there are geological entrances, natural or perhaps artificially.
And that way it's dismissed makes me question it more.
Exactly.
So
it's ironic.
It's ironic, really, because when something's so suppressed and ignored and put into the dark, if you like. But Steve, moving on. So with Tibetan folklore, so is there any stories particularly about Tibetan folklore that you can think of? I'm sure there is translations we could look at, but is there anything you've seen that kind of explains this kind of mysticism, this mystical world that's below Tibet? Or
only really reiterating to do with the existence of what is known as Sambhala or Shambhala, the peaceful place, which is actually described as the crystal city, or the crystal city of the golden palaces, or the crystal city of the shining palaces, which resonates. It's slightly translucent. That suggests that it's vibrating at such a super fast rate that it exists literally on the electromagnetic.
Can you just explain that to the audience, what you mean by vibrating at a huge rate? Just explain that term. I understand, but I want people to understand.
Yes, so it's resonating so fast that it's literally shifting in terms of its, shall we say, its atomic and therefore molecular structure outside of linear space-time. So it's able to cross over the electromagnetic threshold between what we would class as the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension and enter into consistently, or stay between this material dimension and the 4D holographic reality of the astral plane. And so that's one aspect. We know that in Tibetan folklore, there's connections between what they've described as, flying shields or the flying horses of Tibetan Buddhism. And these are archetypal symbols that can be connected to what we would class as a UFO or a spacecraft that is piloted by an ultra-terrestrial or perhaps an extraterrestrial. And it's interesting to note there's also connections with what are known in the Sanskrit language as Vimana, which translates to traversers, which are also interestingly called the Uranavala Kakrika, or flying discs. They're also known as the Urana Sila Kakrika, or flying discs, and are also known as the Vayavida Nauka, or aerial craft. And these are purported to have come from some location within the Hollow Earth.
So where did you get the information on that, on the traversers and Tibet?
That information is come from to do with the information on the Rainbow City and modern, shall we say, contemporary or modern age Hollow Earth theory. So that there's a lot of sightings over Asia and Nepal and Bhutan of a shimmering flying discs that seem to emerge out of the Himalayas, out of the Tian Shan Mountains, out of the Kunlun Mountains, out of the Altai Mountains, and they seem to return to those very remote high altitude locations. Well, where would they be heading to unless they're going into the faraway north, perhaps to the Arctic North Polar region, to where the landmass of Hyperborea was purported to have existed, as well as obviously in northern Russia. But so we know that there is a lot of unanswered questions. And it's very interesting to note that Shambhala, the peaceful place, is located in a landmass that is known as Agartha or Ashgartha, which actually means shining land. So again, we have this reference to the various radiances of these super fast vibratory based, locations within the Hollow Earth, and that are emitting intense luminescences. And they're literally resonating just outside of linear space time, crossing over into the 4D holographic reality of the astral plane, which therefore means that there's the Hollow Earth folklore in regards to what is called the king of the world or the world king, as well as these high priests or temple priests that surround him. And all they are doing is constantly psychically monitoring the behavior, the thoughts, the emotions, and the incarnations of Homo sapiens or human beings on the surface of planet Earth. Means they would be doing that from an ethereal or an etheric location beyond space-time within the various expanses or reaches of the Hollow Earth. And there's many passages, obviously, under Tibet, as we've been discussing, that lead or course down into Shambhala and therefore Agartha, where the world king and these temple priests reside in absolute peace, calmness, and tranquility, and so on. So, we could say it's almost like an internal version of heaven, a golden paradise that's, a vast distance below the surface of planet Earth.
And it's always said that heaven is within us. So it makes sense. If you look at the planet as a being, which it is, if people don't understand that, it is a conscious being, the planet we're on. But actually, having that beautiful kingdom within makes sense. So you had Hyperborea, obviously the destruction, however that happened, climate changes, whatever, and then obviously it moved into Tartaria. Do you think the influence of Tartaria leaked into Tibet? Because obviously it wasn't called Tibet when it existed a long time ago.
No, it was Tibet was always classed as you could say it was almost like a spiritual province, a supernal province. It's always been culturally linked with Chinese mythology, Chinese folklore, and the customs and the traditions of the Chinese people. So obviously the Tibetans are their own ethnic group. They're very distinct, but obviously there's many different Oriental ethnicities across the mainland China area. So yeah, it's definitely feasible to therefore consider the idea that when Great Tartaria existed, that it did have direct cultural and spiritual influences over the mindset, the perspectives of the Tibetan people. And obviously we've done in previous Sacred Wisdom podcasts many different kinds of analysis on the cartographic diagrams and mapping that took place going back to the early medieval period through obviously the Georgian period, the Victorian age. And you can see there that Tibet was very much connected to what was known as Cathay, which became Western China, also known as Oriental Tartary or Oriental Tartaria.
And that is all on the maps, people. That is recorded in history. It's very bizarre. A lot of people don't realize that, but China's how it formed as one country, over time. But with so obviously we've got so many temples, and I from looking at the temples in Tibet, it would seem that they were using this form of telluric energy at one point as well. So harnessing the earth's energy. So what was that? And were they connecting to the Christ consciousness in the same type of way, or
No, no, not exactly. Because again, as I said, Buddhism, whether it's in the Tibetan Autonomous Region in southwestern China or elsewhere, is mainly classed as a secular religion. It's not focused on giving emphasis to, adorating or exemplifying or appreciating the existence of the universal creator. It's more about the integrity of each soul personality.
right?
What we do know is some examples of the occult technology that the Tibetan Buddhists inherited from the civilization that it had existed on the Atlantean continent and on obviously the islands of Atlantis was the singing bowls that they've got.
Of
These are these
course,
huge concave
and bells as well.
metal dishes basically that are interlinked, so small, medium, and large in size, that are harnessed together in various symmetrical patterns, and they're able to create. And I think they were much more profound at doing this many centuries ago, able to create an electroacoustic field that creates an anti-gravity or levitation effect. And as you know, when it comes to levitation, that is a form of magnetic repulsion that therefore pushes against what we class as gravity. So they were able to levitate, and probably still do in very remote locations in the eastern Himalayas, in the Tian Shan Mountains, in the Kunlun Mountains, where there's many of these very, very, very anciently founded Buddhist monasteries, and many of the actual structures or buildings, they probably go back to the antediluvian period. That's before the Great Flood, in these remote, highly elevated geological locations. And they are able to construct without any
Wow.
mortar huge temples by levitating stones that weigh many tons into place by using these types of electroacoustic based occult technology.
Some of the monasteries and the locations they're in Tibet is shocking. And when you said obviously it was back in the antediluvian period and the Great Flood, that
Yeah.
they would have been able to obviously get to that location, because if you can imagine if they had to climb up these hills, but this would have been covered with water with a lot of islands, right? At one point.
I would say it depends at the altitude that those Buddhist monasteries were constructed at. But when you have that kind of occult technology, you don't have really any concerns, because there's no need to literally hewn out or carve out or chisel out,
No.
with teams of Buddhist monks hammering away to then haul tons and tons of rock or stone up into these high altitude locations in the eastern Himalayas, or the Tian Shan Mountains or the Kunlun Mountains and other surrounding areas, because all they need to do is use these various types of singing bowls that are harnessed together in symmetrical patterns to produce specific types of electroacoustic waveforms
Yeah.
that can then levitate huge amounts of rock and stone into place. Literally, I mean, I've seen black and white photographs of huge boulders being driven up very steep altitude areas in the eastern Himalayas, in the Tian Shan Mountains and the Kunlun Mountains, where there is hundreds of Buddhist monks that are being led by Panchen lamas with one or more of these symmetrical layouts of singing bowls. And they're
Interesting.
able also to use them to create an electroacoustic effect. And the resonance can drive away what we would class as negative entities or demons that try and affect the thoughts and therefore the psychology and ultimately the behavior of the Buddhist monks. So they're able to deflect the negative or intrapsychic attacks from negative entities or demons in the 4D holographic reality of the astral plane, or which is the area that those negative entities or demons, as we know, exist in, is the infernal regions. They're able to deflect that from their Buddhist temples, their Buddhist monasteries. These are forms of very anciently founded occult technology, not fully accepted or even understood or discerned in any clear or logical way by Western science.
Yeah.
And so it's classed as nothing but stories, legends, and tales from Tibetan folklore, and is then basically categorized as just another aspect of Tibetan mysticism. And this is one of the reasons why so many of these Western occultists and Eastern occultists and many individuals I've mentioned, like Madame Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky and other individuals in the Theosophical Society, were so enamored and so fascinated by Tibetan mysticism. And obviously, a lot of that arises out of Tibetan Buddhism. So there's a whole multi-layered approach that needs to be taken when it comes to looking at mystical Tibet. Obviously, we have the Hollow Earth, and obviously you have these passageways that go back again before the antediluvian period, before this great flood took place, many of which were probably constructed by the Lemurians and probably some of them by the Nordic Atlanteans. So there's a lot of interconnected, concealed forms of scientific endeavor that are just simply ignored when it comes to mystical Tibet, basically.
Do you think this science is still going on today? Do you think they're still do you think they're still constructing temples like this in this way?
Yes, I do.
And where and obviously it wouldn't be out public information as public as mainstream, but why is no one on this, or is there people on this? Are there people documenting this, or are the monks very, they hide away from people when they do this kind of thing?
Incredible. They don't want any Westerners having any access to the occult technology. It's mainly used for religious and spiritual reasons, to build high up in these remote high altitude locations, Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist temples for private worship, where they can lead consistently austere, very focused, self-disciplined, highly moral, highly ethical lifestyles, far away from the Western world and what they see as a lot of egocentric corruption, egocentric distortion. And, there's been so many problems of human rights abuses in the Tibetan Autonomous Region for many decades that we don't really need to go into. Most people will probably understand what we're referring to. Yeah. So it's understandable that they're going to want to continually retreat from other Homo sapiens or human beings here on planet Earth and live these very privately sealed off lifestyles where nobody's going to get access to that occult technology and nobody's going to be able to reach them, because there's no way to actually access those, even by helicopter, because you need to land a helicopter somewhere, and that's being done deliberately by such individuals because they don't want any contact with other human beings in the material world. They want to live totally spiritually focused lifestyles.
And it seems that that would be an impossibility in this day and age we live in, the world we are in today, when we look at the West, to live a purely spiritual lifestyle without money, without these kind of concepts that we built into the Western world. But I believe that's changing now. I do believe that we're integrating somehow in this information into us. There is a redevelopment of the spiritual self. So it's coming back, you can feel it. So Steve, look, there's so much, as always, there's so many things to discuss around mystical Tibet. And obviously there's probably a lot more stories that we don't know about because a lot is taken or kept secret from certain parts of the world as well. But I mean, I interested in this whole spiritual connection and how we can spiritually connect to these ley lines and this landmass that we're on and actually reactivate this energy that we all want to. We're in deep in ourselves. We all want to do this. So this is what the curiosity about the unknown is. This is why we live, I believe. This is part of our development.
That's right. And I think if we look at the concept of Agartha, or also known as Agartha, the shining land of the hollow earth, where the crystal city of Shambhala, the peaceful place, exists, it's interesting to note in the Sanskrit language that there's many variations for the word, Agartha. So one of which is Ashgartha, which very much connects to Asgard, which was the home of the Norse deities, the home of Thor Asir and his father Odin Asir, which is very much part of the foundation in many ways, really, of Norse mythology and Norse folklore. So I would say it's interesting to note, because geographically, obviously, Scandinavia, whether it's Norway, whether it's Sweden or Finland, is obviously going very much towards the faraway north, edging up towards the Arctic Circle and therefore the Arctic North Polar region. And that we could technically, say, is that in any way connected to the idea that Hyperborea existed as this flourishing highly radiant civilization, the Arctic North Polar region, and perhaps Scandinavia was part of that. And this theorizing, but we could say that Thor Aesir and his father Odin Aesir, as of all the other Norse deities, perhaps they were types of superhumans or super beings
Very
that had
possible.
access to occult technology connected to Hyperborea, but also were able to travel into the entrance in the Arctic North Polar region that went down into the Hollow Earth to Shambhala and therefore Agartha.
Incredible time to be alive. Imagine that. And these
Yes,
giants roaming the land. I mean, I think of Norway and that landscape. And
yes,
when I remember, I went high up on a mountain and looking over Bergen, which is one of the main cities in Norway. And
that's right.
literally, you really can, when you look onto the mountains and you look onto this landscape, you really can see the way these giants could have existed.
That
And it
absolutely.
feels that way there, and even to this day, I believe there's still stories floating around of giants and stuff like that. Not that I've directly heard of them, but the
Mm.
giant history in Norway is absolutely amazing. So one of the most interesting stories I found out around the whole subject about the mysticism of Tibet is the Dalai Lama, where he actually had his location of his house or property. Um, Explain a little bit about that, because there's supposedly actually meant to be some sort of entrance to the Hollow Earth under that.
That is correct. Yeah, from the research I've done, it's just fascinating, this idea that Potala Karpo, as it's known in the Tibetan language, means peak palace. We know that the Potala Karpo, or the peak palace, was also known as the Gunka Karpo, or winter palace, which was the original residence of the fifth Dalai Lama, known as Nagawang Labsang Gyatso,
The way
who
you say them, Steve, and know the language on this is unbelievable. You're so good. Sorry, just how you pronounce all these names is
yeah.
unbelievable.
And he started to occupy what was known as the Gunka Karpo, or Winter Palace, from the 15th of October, 1649. Now, it's very interesting when we look at the aspects of the geography in that area. It's believed, and according in what we know from Tibetan folklore, that there are subterranean passageways that lead down from this, shall we say, Tibetan palace, the Patala,
Mm,
into the Hollow Earth underneath that building. So that's very interesting to note. And
mm.
it's the actual Patala Karpa, or Peak Palace, was constructed on what is known as the Remapo, which means red mountain. So
Wow.
is there an occult symbolism involved in calling that area the Remapo, or red mountain? Again, that's open to speculation.
Wow.
So we then we're then told that in Tibetan folklore we have what's called the Sangwa Show, which means secret lake, where there are two entrances on either side of the Sangwa Show, or secret lake, underneath
Mm,
Patala Karpa, or the Peak Palace.
wow.
And there are apparently at least two Buddhist monks who are 24 hours a day guard those entrances down into the crystal city of Sambala, or Shambhala, the peaceful place within the landmass that resonates beyond space-time. So therefore it's etheric, known as Agartha, meaning the shining land. Now, I
Wow.
find that absolutely incredible. So,
Mm,
each of the Dalai Lamas, until the exile took place at Tenzin Gyatso, had lived in the Patala Karpo, this peak palace in Lhasa in central Tibet. And
mm.
below it, going back, I presume, into the antediluvian period before the Great Flood, was at least two passageways that are described as being luminous tunnels. They exude their own bio radiance, for want of a better word.
Mm.
So that's fascinating, in my opinion. I don't know what you feel about that, Zach.
No, I'm blown away by the whole Hollow Earth idea and the concept that there's these. I feel like these were guardians. There's these certain people have been appointed to guard this
Yes.
peaceful place. You can see on planet Earth how crazy and sporadic human beings are. It would make sense that they wouldn't want certain particular types of humans inside the Hollow Earth because of
Mm.
of this peaceful
Right.
nature and people's egos and lust for information and the way they sometimes kind of it's actually kind of where they get quite destructive when they get power. We can see that
Yeah.
clearly on the surface of planet Earth.
Power,
But
power and money can corrupt the minds of human beings very quickly.
What I thought was interesting, though, is when you said about the red mountain. Now,
Yeah,
obviously, we have red mercury. Now, that is just a random thought that came
of
in.
course, yeah.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. What, you know, maybe this mountain contained that mercury, the special type of mercury that they needed to obtain to power these crafts. Now, that's
What?
just a
Yeah, I mean that's obviously open to
complete
obviously.
speculation, but
Yeah,
anyway,
definitely speculation, absolutely. But
it's my
if we
creative mind.
if we look at the Ramapo or the Red Mountain, we're looking at that color. It's
Mm,
very unique, the idea of Ramapo
yeah.
or the Red Mountain having the Patala Karpa or Peak Palace being constructed on it,
Mm.
which represents the royal seat or the exemplary seat of the Dalai Lama, who is on planet Earth, as we know in Tibetan folklore and aspects of Bonpo shamanism as well, is perceived to be the terrestrial representative of the
Mm.
world king or the king of the world who sits on his golden throne, within the crystal city of Sambhala or Shambhala of the Hollow Earth, which is
Did you
interesting,
feel
which
the Dalai
therefore
Lama
suggests there's a
serves that purpose?
telepathic connection between them.
Do you feel today, the Dalai Lama presently today, do you feel he serves that purpose still?
I think so, but not openly. And I think he's very careful. And
Mm.
you never really see him publicly come out and make any announcements in regards to what we're discussing when it comes to Shambhala and Agartha and the Hollow Earth. So, yeah, he's very careful in his wording. He's very austere. He's very discreet. He's very private. In fact, the way he conveys himself is correct, with a
Mm.
sense of elegance, with a sense of correct mind, correct thought, correct action in his behavior. So I think he does, and he's very he is, shall we say, he is the occult keeper of many secrets connected to the Hollow Earth.
He
So
certainly is, and there is a lot of mystery around Tibet, and so much I'm going to be looking
exactly.
into now as well. What fascinates me is how this technology, or the etheric technology, using the telluric energy, how it's spread around the world and how it spread into different land masses. Maybe they did travel through entrances and tunnel networks and stuff like that to get to other continents. Who knows?
Well,
But
it's
it's
absolute. I mean, in terms of comparative stories and tales from world mythology and world folklore,
mm,
it's very interesting to note that these greenish radiances are seen in all these passageways or luminous tunnels, whether it's in the North American continent, Central America, South America, Western Europe, including obviously the United Kingdom of Great Britain, the Irish Republic, and many other locations.
I
So
mean, you
that's
only have to,
interesting to know.
I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen, but, I've looked at all this and there's loads of imagery of algae that illuminates, mushrooms that under certain
That's right.
bioluminescence
Yeah,
that actually
absolutely.
give off light up whole tunnels. And it's something out of Avatar. I mean,
Mm.
seriously, these are unbelievable caverns that are lit up. And obviously, as well, you know about that, Steve, but all the quartz crystal caves that are
Yeah.
shown,
The stalactites, the stalagmites, because they're many of which are sort of semi-translucent or perhaps almost completely transparent. So any bioluminescence from algae embedded in quartz crystal or other similar types of mineral stone would therefore create beautiful reflective light effects, in such subterranean reaches or expanses that would add to the idea of this hollow earth folklore where a spiritual aspect of it all is really centered on the usage of luminescence, on the understanding of the natural ways of Mother Earth or planet Earth, in her literally in the womb
mm.
of planet Earth. Very,
and
very deep archetypal concepts, really.
and how, like, we're kind of brought to a point now we get like a polished stone, a polished crystal, and that's meant to be like have the healing property of that. But then people dismiss the concept or idea that
Right, they
these
do.
cave networks underneath with all these crystals in would have been powerful energy centers at some point, or whatever was placed on top of them.
Connected to specific geomagnetic ley lines,
Of
specific
course.
dimensional intersections that were basically portals or access routes into the 4D holographic reality, the astral plane. And obviously, Bonpo shaman, across the Tibetan autonomous region, and many of those Bonpo shaman live in very remote areas, such as many of the Buddhist monks do, high up in their Buddhist monasteries, their Buddhist temples in the eastern Himalayas. The Tian Shan Mountains, the Kunlun Mountains have a very deep, a very profound awareness of these geomagnetic ley lines and how important it is to construct Pacific buildings or, Pacific types of area. So I was saying Pacific worship areas because it's seen that the resonances there are useful for the improving human health, for the actual mental and psychological conditions of human beings to be consistently stabilized and to improve. And these things aren't seen as relevant at all by Western science. Again, it's just classed as aspects of either conspiracy theory or it's unproven.
Some imaginary idea that it's just kind of floating around and somebody's thought of it. And then, no, I mean, like our interaction on these ley lines, I don't think people need to be aware of this, that we can activate so much on these ley lines. And there are reasons. You'll find the ley lines all over the world, not just in Tibet. Obviously, we spoke many times about the ley lines in England and St. Michael's line and all these different energy lines running over the earth. But these have properties, and with our interaction with them, we actually can generate certain specific fields of frequency. All right. So, whether that's meditation, peace, tranquility, it's healing energy. All right. So we can use this to harness and bring up our spirits and nurture this physical world we are in instead of making it destructive. And me and Stephen, I'm sure some of you know, but we've written a book, Mysterious Realities, which is available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. And there isn't a chapter specifically on mystical Tibet, but we are developing various ideas and stuff. So you look out for that. Stephen, thanks, my brother. You're always mind blowing, and your articulation of words is absolutely amazing. I can't believe how you pronounce all these words. It's incredible. So thank you, Steve.
That's right.
Thanks a lot, and it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.